Good evening, scholars. I apologize for my absence. I'd like us to continue with our study of World War II, so please incorporate this into your class notes, and we will go over any questions you may have on Wednesday. So first, what I'd like you to do is pause this, and I'd like you to optic this political cartoon using the methods that we've used traditionally in this class, and we will talk about it again on Wednesday. So moving right along, last class we talked about the start of World War II and the Sitzkrieg, and Hitler had now taken over several Scandinavian countries. So what we're now going to get into is his takeover of France. And so in April, he had taken over Holland and Denmark. By May, he had still using his Blitzkrieg. He had taken over Holland and Belgium, and so now France. And if you remember historically, the relationship between France and Germany has never been good. And so he's ready to go into France. How he went into France is what is interesting, because if you remember with the Schlieffen Plan, they went in through Belgium. Now let's go back to this this war. Now I'm going to flip to this next map, and you can of course go back, but what you're looking at right here is what's known as the Maginot Line. And if remember, we talked about last class that in the Treaty of Versailles, France had actually wanted this to be a buffer state to keep between France and Germany. In the Treaty of Versailles, they didn't get the buffer state, but this was demilitarized on Germany's side, and France had been fortifying this side. So it was really shocking that the Germans went through this fortified area instead of going through Belgium, which is totally a weak spot for France. So this was very shocking that this is the way the Germans came in with their use of Blitzkrieg. The Germans plowed in. Now I'm going to again go back to this map where it says the British and French troops were split in half. So basically what's happening is as the Germans are blitzkrieging their way into France's troops are being forced into Paris, and the British troops are being forced to the coast, Dunkirk Beach. So again, this is what I'm talking about, and it was brilliant because it's much easier to beat one group of troops versus both. So the French were forced into Paris, and then Brits were isolated on the beaches of Dunkirk. And so basically what's going to happen is when the government of Britain finds out that there are thousands of British just isolated on these beaches, basically all hands on deck. Boats were sent to France called Operation Dynamo, where basically they saved thousands and thousands and thousands of men, brought them back over Britain. But the problem is that by leaving France, this left France all alone. So what's going to happen to France? Well, basically we talked about the Treaty of Versailles. That was Chamberlain's policy. And one man in particular is very important, which is why I made him red, Winston Churchill. Throughout all of the Age of Anxiety, Churchill was adamantly against Chamberlain's idea. Churchill was super against the Nazis. He wanted to stop Hitler. He wanted to stop the Nazis. So Chamberlain retired, and Churchill was the new prime minister. And basically, he promised the French that he was going to support them, but he basically said, do what you can against the Germans. I'm sorry. So with the Brits gone, there is this inevitable surrender of the French. And I have on here a railway car. I don't know if you remember, if you go back to the armistice from World War I, everyone was forced to sign that, including the Germans, in the railway car. And that was something Hitler never forgot about. So he made the French sign their armistice in a railway car. Again, holds a very good grudge. So what happens now is I'm going to flip the screen again. And France is very large, so what Hitler decides to do is, instead of wasting troops and occupying the entire country, he occupies the top half with Paris, and the bottom half becomes quote-unquote free zone. This is called Vichy France. And basically this is a puppet state. We talked about puppet governments like that the Japanese did. So this is the French puppet state. The leader of the French puppet state is Philippe Pétain, and one other name I'm going to give you is Charles de Gaulle. And Charles de Gaulle is basically, he makes his way up to London, and the entire time that the war is going on, he is planning this Free France movement. He's planning a possible invasion over here to save France. Now, with that being said, I want to draw your eyes here, and this is not in your notes, so you might need to pause a couple times. See where it says Atlantic Wall? Hitler's not a dummy. And so basically, from the get-go, Hitler starts fortifying this massive, massive coastline with forts. He, covers it with Nazis because he knows that when the Allied powers are ready to free France, they're going to come in through the Atlantic wall area. So remember that when we talk about D-Day in about a week and a half. Hitler flew in just to take his picture in Paris. So what's going to happen with Britain? Well, Britain's next. Basically, all of Western Europe has fallen to Hitler, and so by August of 1940, Hitler orders bombing on England. This is remembered as Eagle Day or London Blitz. The Luftwaffe, those are the Nazi airplanes we talked about last class. Now, this is such a fantastic battle to talk about because it proved that Hitler had a weak spot. The Brits had found the Enigma, which was the radar detecting device of the Nazis. And if you've seen the Imitation Game, you probably have a good idea of what I'm talking about. And so they were able to crack the code. And we'll talk more about this details on Wednesday. But basically, by cracking the code, they could, keep 1 foot up ahead of the Germans. And so why this is so fantastic is that this is the first time, we've talked about Hitler for a couple days now, this is the first time that Hitler has to change his plans. He's never had to change his plans, and that's so, so, so important when we're talking about psychological victory and giving the Allied powers a little bit of, hope. So who's Hitler to attack next? Well, basically, he's not, what I want you to understand is he's not going to quit on Britain. He's still going to continuously attack Britain, but this is the first time that he didn't win something. And so what he's going to focus on is the Soviet Union. And before he gets to the Soviet Union, before he can send troops to the Soviet Union, he is unfortunately going to be stuck with having to help Mussolini. And if you remember, we talked, last chapter that Mussolini had started to extend his own personal empire. He went into Ethiopia. Ethiopia is in Africa, so he was extending throughout northern Africa, hoping to get the Suez Canal. The problem is, if you remember from a couple chapters ago, the Suez Canal is part of Egypt, and that's British territory, and Britain was kicking butt against Mussolini. And so Mussolini calls up Hitler and says, oh my goodness, I'm going to need some help. So Hitler sends Rommel, Nazi man Rommel, and his nickname is Desert Fox, to help Mussolini. Why he gets that nickname is because most northern Africa is desert, and he was very, very good fighting in the desert, so thus Desert Fox. So the campaign in Africa is going to be back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth wins. We're going to continue to talk about the campaign in Africa on and on until the very end of the war. Mussolini also attempts to go into Greece, and if you're looking at the map right here, here's Greece. So he's fighting here in northern Africa, not doing a great job. He attempts to go into Greece, but unfortunately he yet again needs help from Hitler. So yet again, Hitler needs to send troops down into Greece to help Mussolini. And I want you to think about why this could be bad for Hitler. So if you want to pause, think about it, write that down. We can come back to that on Wednesday. So, like I said before, Hitler's next item on his agenda is the Soviet Union. And so he intended to invade the Soviet Union in the spring of 1941. But because he had to help Mussolini, he had to put his plans on hold. So he sent, like I said, he sent troops down into Greece to help Mussolini. He goes into Yugoslavia. Joseph Tito is a very important name we'll talk about even after World War II. And Joseph Tito, he has an interesting relationship with Hitler in that he kind of maintains his autonomy by, working with him. So by July of 1941, finally, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. I also want you to think back to the Non-Aggression Pact and how shocking this was for Stalin, and that Stalin had signed that pact with him, promising 10 years of peace with Hitler. So this was mind-blowing. I mean, Stalin, this really rocked his world. So Hitler's goal is to get more land, get rid of the Bolsheviks. Stalin issued the scorched earth policy, and I want you to think about the answer to that, and then we'll talk about it on Wednesday. Now, remember, this invasion was supposed to be in the spring, so all of his troops had spring summer uniforms, so they invaded late summer. And so, as you know, we've talked about this, it gets very, very cold in Russia, so they had no uniforms, no winter uniforms. This was catastrophic. They're dying, they're, you know, freezing to death, the horses are dying, the tanks are freezing over. Leningrad, what the Battle of Leningrad, that battle literally went on for 900 days, and we're going to come back to that. This is a pretty epic battle. As the Germans approached Moscow, if you remember from a couple chapters ago, this is the new capital of the Soviet Union. So why Moscow? Well, this is the capital. If you're going to capture a country, you got to go for the capital. Now, this is epic. By December of 1941, so about 6 months later, 5 months later, because of the conditions and because it was so cold, Germany had to turn around. Hitler called them back. This is of epic proportion because Napoleon Bonaparte had to do this, if you remember, in 1812. And then this is huge for Hitler. This is a huge slap in the face. A lot of historians blame the decision of invading the USSR on why they lost the war. So that's kind of an epic place to end, but we're going to stop that now. For class on Wednesday, please make sure in the margins of your notes you write down if you have any questions. And since I'm not there today, we will talk about the political cartoon assignment on Wednesday. Email me if you have any questions at all. Again, I apologize for not being in class, and I will see you tomorrow.